welcome to The Breach Show. This is episode number 2. I'm Donia Ziai, the host of the show here in our Montreal studio. I'm here with our regular panelists, Pam Palmater in Toronto, Elle Jones in Halifax, and Martin Lukács here in Montreal. They probably need no introduction. Pam is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and author. Elle is a poet, educator, and organizer. And Martin is a journalist and the managing editor of The Breach. Welcome back, everyone.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Hey, it's awesome.
Let's get into it. So today we're going to cover 2 topics, Canada's military spending and the Liberals' new plan for reducing emissions. And we're also experimenting with a new segment, a kind of speaker's corner at the end of the show, so stay tuned for that. But to start with the military spending, we know that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been putting a lot of pressure on NATO members to beef up their military spending. We're recording this episode just before the Liberals announced their new federal budget. Here's a clip I want to play of Anita Anand, the defense minister, speaking in mid-March.
I personally am bringing forward aggressive options which would see potentially exceeding the 2% level, hitting the 2% level, and then below the 2% level. My view is that my role is to bring forward a number of different options for our government to consider, and that's exactly what I'm doing together with the Chief of Defense Staff, together with my Deputy Minister and our respective teams.
Martin, we keep hearing about this 2%. Has Canada met its 2% target? Can Canada do more to meet its 2% target? What is this number? Can you break down where it came from?
The first thing to understand is that NATO isn't some peaceful, neutral group. It is an aggressive alliance dominated by the U.S. and mostly serving its interests. And NATO members, especially Canada, have militaries that are tightly integrated into the U.S. military, and most of our arms manufacturers are essentially branch plants of the U.S. So naturally, NATO and the U.S. have been putting huge pressure on countries to increase their military spending, because that means more money for the U.S. military-industrial complex, and it means the Canadian military primed to be involved with U.S. interventions around the world. So back in 2006, all NATO member countries were basically pushed to commit to 2% military spending of their GDP. And basically since then, US leaders from Obama onward to Trump have basically scolded Canada for not reaching that target. Canada currently spends 1.4% of its GDP on military spending, which is about $25 billion a year. The Parliamentary Budget Office basically did a calculation and found that if Canada were to reach that 2% threshold, NATO threshold, that would mean spending 20 to 25 billion more on military spending, which is in total about $50 billion. Mm-hmm. The question is, what enemies does Canada have? Are they doing this simply to, appease the U.S. government and, arms manufacturers? Could there not be better things to spend it on? $50 billion could, for instance, build us 1 million homes in Canada. It could create free university tuition and childcare. It could basically roll out all the wind and solar power we need, and we'd have money left over.
And going with that 2% NATO target, there's been breathless coverage in the media about how supposedly small Canada's military spending is. There was a graph actually recently in the CBC that's pretty emblematic of this. I just want to put it up on the screen. And so for those listening to the podcast, the graph has Canada ranked as number 25 among all NATO nations when it comes to defense spending. But when we look at the actual dollar amounts of how much Canada is actually spending on the military, it's one of the top spenders of NATO. And here's another graph now. It was put together using NATO numbers by the organization Peace Quest. And it actually shows that Canada is number 6 in NATO nations when it comes to military spending. So, Elle, I wanted to ask you, you wouldn't know it from all the mainstream media coverage, just how big of a player Canada is militarily. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I have to say that it's funny that we're all Trump now, because weren't we all making fun of Trump when he was going around the world berating everybody for not spending 2% on NATO? And now we're all Trump. So 2% is unhealthy and we all need to go for the skim option, right? So, I mean, we've seen this for a long time. I can't think of a federal election, certainly in my lifetime, where the war spending, military has ever come up, except in terms of people asserting things like support for Israel or support for the military. So we never have a national debate by any of our parties about how much we should spend on the military, what the military does, do we support this? So there's a de facto kind of silent consent that's assumed by the majority. We see these propaganda stories all the time. The CBC in Nova Scotia just ran a story about a factory in Lunenburg, which is where the Blue Nose, this famous ship, it's on the dime, so this is like part of Nova Scotia's provincial identity. So now they're making, in the same town that made the Blue Nose, handcrafting is still alive because they make parts for Lockheed Martin jets, right? So there's no discussion, of course. They don't talk to anybody about militarization. I remember CBC running a story a few years ago bragging that Canada holds the record now for the longest kill shot, which is like killing somebody extrajudicially, right? So we have the best snipers in the world. So, what we have had over years is a presentation of Canada as a peacekeeping nation that only intervenes, when it's kind and nice and we're just saving people, which is, of course, in general, part of the narrative of imperial countries. And then no discussion about military spending. We don't have a broad-based defund the military movement, even though it's deeply tied to the militarization of the police. And then the media says nothing and presents it as consensus. So, how are Canadians even supposed to begin to understand these issues?
Another reason that the Department of Defense has been giving these days for increasing its military spending, Pam, is the supposed threat to the North and our northern borders. There's this claim that we need to protect quote unquote Arctic sovereignty after Russia attacked Ukraine. I mean, first of all, can you help me understand what the security threat is to the Arctic right now?
Well, I think it's a perceived threat on the one hand, but it's also another justification for Canada to consistently have a reason to militarize the North. And that's something that Inuit people, First Nations, have long gone to the UN and said, stop militarizing our territories. So they do it under the guise of so-called Arctic sovereignty. But what they're really doing is trying to consistently assert Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic, which already has a sovereign people there, and that's the Inuit people. They're sovereign. They're the first and only legitimate sovereign entity in the North. Canada's is only an asserted sovereignty, and it continually has to flex and spend money on the military and militarize our territories in order to consistently enforce that, when legally and politically and relationship-wise, it would be much better to just simply support Inuit sovereignty in the way that they want to. Sovereignty isn't just about how big your guns are. Sovereignty can also be about living there and asserting your sovereignty and living as Inuit people. You don't need guns to do that. And I think people, again, like Elle said, are not having these conversations on a much larger scale, that the militarization of Indigenous territories is something that we have been fighting against for decades, both at the United Nations level and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, saying Canada's got to stop militarizing our territories. And now, interestingly enough, that's a part of the new United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the new bill C-15 that has been recognized as having applicability in Canadian law, that Canada's got to stop militarizing our territories, and that if we want them militarized, we'll let Canada know. But I've never heard a call by First Nations or Inuit to militarize our territories.
And even in response to this announcement, it was the Premier of the Northwest Territories who said, if you want to talk about Arctic security, we're worried about climate change. We're worried about housing. We don't have broadband internet. This is not the kind of security and sovereignty we need, But of course, it's much easier for Canada to engage in these grand military exercises. And it was funny because in March, they ran this exercise with the US in the Arctic, which they hilariously called Noble Defender, where they did these air exercises. But again, much easier to do that than make meaningful change, right?
Exactly. And think about the prioritization of threats. You know, all around the world, there's different kinds of threats. They have different priorities, different kinds of impacts. What is the potential threat from Russia right now, who's pretty much just focused on Ukraine, versus the threat of climate change to the Arctic territory, to Inuit territory? It's not just a threat. It's actually unraveling and has been unraveling and is having substantive impacts on the Inuit for quite some time, but will have also worldwide implications in terms of climate disasters and temperatures and ice melting and all of those things. That's the biggest threat right now to the Inuit. And you've also got all of the issues around water security and food sovereignty and housing and healthcare and all of those things for the Inuit, who, you know, primarily are the ones that live in the north. So if you look at the most immediate and substantial threats, those are the ones we should be addressing, not militarizing the north.
Can we just not leave unremarked, like the name Noble Defenders? Like Canada can't stop using the colonial overtones despite itself.
And
Yeah.
you know, it sounds like either like a Led Zeppelin song or like the theme song for like an 80s children's show, like Noble Defenders, if you need a, you know. It's like the cat version of Paw Patrol, like Noble Defenders, like the kids, like cats that are like, one's a fighter jet and one's a military procurement and one funds a poetry prize, and they're all cats.
Yeah. Go Power Rangers. It's kind of the same thing.
Exactly. You know, there's this kind of like gaslighting that goes on in the names. Like you could almost play a game like, is this a corporate entity or the name of a missile, right? So hidden hand of the market, is that a missile? Or is that, you know, an economic plan? Because I've been reading all this stuff, you know, getting prepped for this about, you know, the military, and you get so confused because after a while you start to be like, oh, is that the name of a military program? So I was reading an article on Lockheed Martin. They were talking about emerging opportunities. I'm like, okay, is that the name of a jet? Like the emerging opportunities? Is that a bomb? Or is that...
We should have a
the
game where you have
idea?
to guess.
Yeah, you know? Like, is this a corporate plan, a government budget, or, you know, in the name of a missile? But this is about the euphemisms, of which national security is, of course, the biggest one. At the same time as NATO is forming in 1949, this is, you know, Cold War politics. It's the same time as Canada begins persecuting gay people in the public service under the name of national security. This is preventing immigrants under national security. So this has always reached back to this idea of Canada as white, settler, colonial, patriarchal. All these things are part of the same idea. And now we're hearing that, you know, NATO should be declared a fundamental part of Canadian values. And that's another euphemism, Canadian values, which also meant no Muslims and, you know, report your neighbor on the barbaric tip line.
Yeah, I mean, euphemisms are just so pervasive in the discussions about foreign policy and military spending. I mean, the one that we hear all the time that Chrystia Freeland loves to say is that Canada supports a rules-based international order. But that's really just a euphemism for a U.S.-based global order.
Yeah.
Sounds like the rule of law here in Canada. Canada supports, and there must be rule of law in this country, which means the law of rulers and the colonizers, and they pick and choose what they want and what they don't based on what's good for them. It's extractive, it's exploitative, and we all pay the price for the injuries and the human rights violations and the damage to the environment by the so-called rule of law.
Well, speaking of double-speak and useless military exercises, we can't not talk about the fact that the Liberals have also just announced that they're negotiating the final purchase of F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin. And I want us to watch a clip first from Justin Trudeau. This is in 2015 when he was running for Prime Minister against Stephen Harper.
New Liberal government won't buy the overpriced F-35 stealth fighter jet. It's a stealth fighter that will cost tens of billions more than what Harper promised, a stealth fighter that can't defend our Arctic, a stealth fighter that's not actually stealth, and until yesterday, a fighter jet that Stephen Harper's own government put on hold for those same reasons. I can tell you, for Canadian taxpayers, it'll be a nightmare.
Okay, so overpriced, can't protect the Arctic, not even stealth, and a nightmare for taxpayers. I'll go to you. This is what he was saying in 2015. I mean, are any of these things any different now, 7 years later?
No, and this is the thing. These jets, they say they have a $17 billion price tag, but the actual term over their life is $77 billion, has been estimated. This is a huge amount of money. They're not, obviously, like, what are they defending us from? I don't remember the last air attack, that we were engaged in. So we know they're going to be used as an offensive force. They burn tons of fuel. All kinds of studies have showed the Pentagon is the world's #1 polluter, right? And the military always is the biggest footprint. So it doesn't fit with any kind of carbon change. And they're actually exempted, right? The military is actually exempted from all these carbon laws, right? Like they don't have to... They don't count in that. So they're given a complete exemption from the environmental damage when they do the most. And then it's just this like Star Wars G.I. Joe. I hate to make a G.I. joke, someone might slap me across the face, but it's like,
Too soon.
G.I. Too soon. Protect Black women. No, I mean, it's like G.I. Joe. And I'm not saying this like out of no, I'm saying this is like just the lure of these expensive toys, right? They're cool. They go really fast. They've got all these stats. You want to sit and want to pretend you're firing? We've all been indoctrinated in this from Hollywood our whole lives. So there's this idea that you're not like a real serious country unless you have a bunch of like Top Gun jets and you can, go and play like you're in some kind of movie.
What Elle's saying reminds me of this brief moment of insight from Justin Trudeau back in like 2013 when Canada under Harper was buying the C-18 aircrafts, and Justin said something to the effect of, all these generals just want to whip them out and show off how big they are. And it was this like amazing off-the-cuff moment from Trudeau where he was exactly right about the patriarchal nature of warfare and militarism. And of course, all the liberal handlers and the media jumped on him and were like, how dare he say something like that? So irresponsible. But just to take things back to 2015, when the Liberals were initially against these F-35 purchases, there's this great line from their platform that kind of just sums up the whole issue. At the time, they said, "We will not buy the F-35 stealth fighter bomber. The primary mission of our fighter aircraft should remain the defense of North America, not stealth first strike capability." And speaking of like euphemisms, stealth first strike capability is another one of those because it basically just means bombing the shit out of places that the US wants bombed. And it's not a surprise that basically the day after the Trudeau government announced the F-35 purchase, the Minister of Defense was on the phone to the Pentagon, reassuring the US that they had finally made the purchase. And, it kind of tells you everything about Canada's military and foreign policy orientation. Over the last 2 decades, their fighter jets have, bombed Serbia, bombed Libya, bombed Iraq, bombed Syria. And with this purchase, that's what we're going to be seeing in the next few years. Continuous subservience and assists to the US empire.
Yeah, and Elle, you mentioned briefly the other aspect of this, which is that we're talking about climate-destroying weapons, right? And spending millions, or billions, I should say, billions of dollars on these unnecessary fossil fuel-producing weapons at exactly the time when we need to be moving off fossil fuels and investing in a just transition. And so let's use that to shift gears a little bit and go into our next segment, which was going to be to talk about the Liberals' new plan for reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Last week, they committed $9 billion in new spending to bring emissions down by the year 2030. And I want to play a clip of Trudeau making the announcement about that plan.
This is the moment for the oil and gas sector to invest in the sustainable future that will be good for business, good for communities, and good for our future. Big oil lobbyists have had their time on the field. Now it's over to the workers and engineers who will build solutions for their sector, for their communities, and for their kids.
Martin, have the Liberals really kicked oil lobbyists off the field?
I mean, despite what Trudeau says, the Liberals have not only not kicked him off the field, they're very much on the field, and they're on the same team. And, you know, the irony is that Trudeau made this climate announcement at the Globe Forum in Vancouver, which is funded by Shell and Suncor. So it basically means oil lobbyists are also the sponsors of the field. So the breach actually crunched the numbers on lobbyist data a few months back, and we found that under the Trudeau government, Big Oil had met with them even more often than they had met with the Harper Conservative government, up to 5 meetings and contacts with the government on a daily basis. This plan that we have now from Trudeau actually lets oil and gas industry cut even less emissions than any other sector. So it's no surprise that Big Oil is extremely happy with this. They, CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, came out with a statement that basically applauding the plan for recognizing, quote, global demand for natural gas and oil will continue for decades. Of course, we need to get off oil and gas like yesterday. But meanwhile, you know, oil and gas industry is basically laughing their way to the bank, having made something to the tune of $115 billion in profits just last year alone. And I think ultimately, like the mainstream media in this country kind of goes through this ritual with the Trudeau government when it comes to their climate plans. Every 6 months to a year or so, they say, okay, this time the Trudeau government is actually serious about climate change. They've come out with another bold and ambitious plan. But I don't think we should be surprised by the fact that Big Oil keeps running the show. Trudeau essentially told us who he was back in 2013. He had just become leader of the Liberal Party, and he took a trip to Calgary where he gave a speech to the Calgary Petroleum Club. So he was speaking to a group of oil execs, and he told them, surprisingly, I think for a lot of people who are know about his environmental reputation, that he thought Stephen Harper had failed them. He had made too many enemies. He had basically not delivered on his pledge to turn Canada into an oil superpower that was getting oil everywhere. And and Trudeau said basically, look, you need a politician with a lighter touch, a diplomatic touch, who can, bring in a few environmental policies, ultimately so that we can get your oil to market. And that essentially is what Trudeau has accomplished over the last 7 years.
One thing I just wanted to add from that clip is Trudeau's like, no more corruption. We're not going to have oil lobbyists. We're going to have engineers. It's like, didn't SNC Lavalin almost bring your government down? Yeah. No more engineers either. Puppies.
Yeah, that's just none of them.
None of them.
So one of the things in the emissions reduction plan that I wanted us to spend just a couple of quick minutes on is the new tax breaks, Martin, that they're introducing for carbon capture and storage. I was actually looking at the pre-budget consultations that the Department of Finance did, and there's obviously always a submission from from CAP, Canada's biggest oil and gas lobby, and they specifically were asking for tax breaks on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Can you just tell us what CCUS, as it's known, is and why industry is such a fan of it?
Yeah, I mean, carbon capture is essentially the latest smoke and mirrors delay tactic on the part of oil and gas. It's an unproven, unscalable, prohibitively expensive technology that is essentially supposed to capture carbon dioxide from facilities and plants and then store it underground. Mm-hmm. The problem, and this is a very big one, is that 80% of existing carbon capture facilities, they actually capture carbon dioxide and then use it to extract even more oil. It's a process called enhanced oil recovery. And just continuing on the theme of euphemisms, it basically uses carbon dioxide to get the dregs of oil from oil fields. This isn't a plan to reduce fossil fuels. It's a plan to essentially prolong and entrench their use. So naturally, oil and gas is extremely happy to keep digging and burning. And what they've done now is these oil and gas lobbyists have persuaded the Liberal government to actually pay for these facilities to be built. Mm. if reports are true, what we're going to see in the budget on Thursday is a tax credit that will have the Liberal government pay 75% of these essential techno fixes that are simply going to continue the status quo and entrench oil and gas production and expansion for 20, 30, 40 more years.
And it's worth noting the Liberals are simultaneously, while giving these tax credits, are committing to cutting fossil fuel subsidies. But essentially, and this was pointed out a month ago, or I think it was, there were something like 400 academics, 500 organizations across the country, and 30,000 other signatories who were saying, no, this is another form of subsidy. You're essentially continuing to subsidize the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I mean, between 2018 and 2020, the Liberal government federally and the provinces gave 14 times more funding to fossil fuels than they did to renewable energy. Mm-hmm. So, they continue giving oil and gas basically what they want, and disguising it as, in new forms of hidden subsidy. I mean, the Liberals have committed to getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and then they engaged in their usual weasel tactics by saying, oh no, we were just talking about inefficient subsidies, not efficient subsidies, and now they've created even more subsidies that we'll probably see in tomorrow's budget.
And of course, the Liberals bought a pipeline. So, Pam, I wanted to ask you, there was a new estimate just a few weeks ago that building TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, is now going to cost around $21 billion, which is 70% higher than it was previously estimated to be. And just a reminder to our audience, the federal government bought that pipeline in 2018. Despite the fact that it trampled over Indigenous lands and rights, despite the fact that there was huge pushback from environmentalists, and the project has basically just been riddled with delays and ballooning costs.
The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is of vital strategic interest to Canada. It will be built.
And I know that you're attending a rally this Saturday, Pam, against TMX Saturday. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you'll all be demanding?
Yeah, well, we're gathering specifically because over the time of the pandemic, we weren't able to gather as much as we wanted to. We weren't able to be in the streets safely as much as we wanted to. So we've got representatives from a whole bunch of different nations impacted by the pipeline. We also have First Nation advocates and human rights advocates and environmentalists all coming together to talk about what we need to do to stop Trans Mountain Pipeline. Not just Trans Mountain Pipeline, obviously Coastal Gas, LNG, and any of the other ones that are directly contributing to ongoing contamination and climate change, breaching Indigenous rights, but specifically Trans Mountain Pipeline, because there's simply no logical reason for going forward with it now.
Elle, just as a final question to you, what do you think in your mind is an effective movement? What would an effective movement look like that can actually be a match for the Liberals' doublespeak and euphemisms and inaction, which has kind of been the theme for our whole conversation today? But yeah, specifically in relation to the climate crisis.
I mean, we have seen extremely effective young people's movements against the climate crisis for a long time. Obviously, Indigenous sovereignty is inherently tied up with climate justice, right? And there's no difference between that. But the problem, as with all movements, with the environmental movement, is there's always two streams, right? There's the radical movement that understands we have to end the status quo and that this is a problem rooted in capitalism and consumerism and corporatism, and we have to change those things. And then there's the green energy, just recycle, we can actually create different job stream. And that's always the danger. With any movement, that always happens. You have an extremely liberal movement that's kind of sold to people as environmentalism. So I think, it's not like we don't have a large environmental movement, but to continue it, we need to, I think, also be making the connection that the environment is at the root of a lot of injustices. You can't talk about prison justice without talking about the environment. Things like prisons are located in rural towns that have been stripped of their resource base, and then a prison comes in as an economic driver, and you talk about creating jobs, right? We can't talk about the military, right? Like that's about environmental justice. Refugee and immigration and global migration is about climate justice. Work is inherently about those things. So all the movements that we have can be brought together. I think it's just really making those connections and expanding between movements and making sure that we're always building a solidarity, because we always have governments and corporations and military and media and, you know, the academic institutions, they're all in solidarity. So our trick always has to be in the greatest amount of solidarity in our movements to counter that. And when we do that, we win.
And I think for a brief moment between 2019 and 2020, we had actually seen a radical framework go mainstream in the Green New Deal. You know, this is a political framework that really marries dramatic action on climate change with, you know, bold, public-led, major government intervention in racial justice, in supporting Indigenous rights, in building out an epic program of, you know, public transit and livable communities and renewable energy. And, you know, all paid for by massive taxes on the wealthy and corporations. And, you know, that, I think, is a winning electoral agenda, besides also, you know, staving off climate catastrophe. And I remember, like, in 2019, 2020, there were liberals like Catherine McKenna who were kind of, like, ostentatiously posting about on social media about how they had, you know, were reading eco-socialist books like the one by Eric Holthaus. And I remember people like Gerald Butts, the former advisor to the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, about, you know, I saw him retweeting posts from like the Sunrise Movement, which is the US youth-led climate justice movement. And I remember chuckling, thinking, okay, clearly the liberals are anxious about the potential of the Green New Deal because they're really trying to posture and co-opt that energy. And it, to me, is a shame that the NDP's leadership has been, you know, too out of touch to run aggressively with that political framework, because I think it can win.
We'll end that segment there, but I'm excited to move us into our new segment, something we're experimenting with on the show, which we're jokingly, maybe half jokingly for now, calling The Preach. It's going to be short takes from whoever's got something on their mind in a given week. I know, Pam, you've got something for us this week. What's on your mind?
So the federal government just announced that it's not going to put a penny more than $21.4 billion into the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I'm sorry, what? Trudeau bought this pipeline in 2018 for $4.5 billion with a total project estimate of $7.4 billion. And that was bad enough, since it's Canadians and First Nations who ultimately pay the price out of our own pockets. Trudeau tried to sell us on this rash purchase by claiming that Canada needed the profits from the pipeline to pay for green technology. No one believed that. The only reason why Trudeau bought this pipeline was to try to circumvent the constitutionally protected rights of First Nations to decide what happens on their lands. He thought that by turning a private project into one owned by Canada, he could argue that it's of the national interest and therefore must proceed. In fact, even before the Supreme Court of Canada and the NEB had finalized their decisions, Trudeau said, and I quote, "It will proceed." But then, in 2020, the cost for the Trans Mountain soared to $12.6 billion, which at that time, the Parliamentary Budget Officer had his doubts about the profitability of the project. So, of course, the only rational thing that Trudeau could do with our money and our collective futures is to dump even more money into the project. And now the projected costs are $21.4 billion? Who on earth is overseeing this project anyway? At this point, it should be no surprise to any of us that the Parliamentary Budget Officer's updated analysis says that not only will the project not be profitable, but it will leave us all with a huge deficit. There will be no money for green technology or initiatives as promised. There will be no respect for the rights of First Nations, and it'll help make climate change much, much worse. I think it's long past time to cut our collective financial losses, prevent future damage to First Nations lands and waters, to stop the violence against Indigenous women and girls from man camps, and the irreparable damage to the planet. Oh, and hello, NDP? I sure hope in your deal with the Liberals that you secured a commitment to cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Oh no, you didn't? Well then, I expect that you're going to have to face down the people this weekend, and many more weekends to come. We all want a safe future for our children, and that doesn't include Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Elle, we've got your clip ready to go. Should we play that first and then have you jump in?
All we did was love one another. We took care of one another. We took care of our coworkers. We spoke up for our coworkers. We fought back for our coworkers. We put our lives on the line for our coworkers until the point where the coworkers started doing it to their coworkers. And now the workers are organizing themselves. I don't have to do much anymore, even though I'm still out there every single day, day and night, nights and days. I realized that love is what got this union to where it is. It wasn't nothing else, no resources, once again, no money. It was just people coming together.
So that was Chris Small speaking at a U.S.-Cuba normalizing event. I think he's one of the most exciting young organizers that we've seen in a while. And I want to thank Amazon. I want to thank Amazon for giving us Chris Small, because when he started, he was working in a warehouse and all he wanted to do was get a promotion. And he thought, I'll keep my head down. He started as a picker. He became a manager. And he thought, in a couple of years, level 4 is there for me. That's what I want. And then they fired him because they said he stole 2 minutes of time from the company. It turned out they were wrong and they reinstated him, but now they began putting him on different shifts. They wouldn't let him transfer to the warehouse he wanted, and still all he wanted was to get his promotion in his job. He never thought he was going to be an activist. And then he ends up at a different plant. And of course, COVID happens, and he ends up advocating for PPE and he gets fired. And all he wanted was his job back. And then Amazon and Jeff Bezos came together and they said they were going to make Chris Smalls the face of the movement because he was not smart and he was not articulate. So I thank them for that anti-blackness, because from that moment, Chris Smalls realized who he was and he began organizing the warehouse, which is 8,000 people, the size of a small town. And every day at the bus stop, these people just barbecued, they handed out leaflets, they had less than $100,000. They were combated by Amazon that spent $4 million. The typical union movement often has millions of dollars from major unions who did not support these young, largely Black and Latino workers, were not supported at all. And they successfully were the first union to organize Amazon. Now 50 different warehouses have come together and they are pushing for unions too. And it is a movement, but it is more than just a movement at Amazon. It is more than just a labor movement. This is a young Black-led movement that understands the radical Black tradition and has reached out, talking about Cuba and our international justice, talking about the military, talking about racial justice around the world. And we are seeing this radical spirit that, by the way, everybody pretends not to remember that Martin Luther King Jr. ended his life speaking about. When was he shot? When he brought together the labor movement and the Black movement and said, I'm standing up for striking sanitation workers. So Chris, watch your back. This is when they start shooting you. This is when they shot Fred Hampton when he started organizing workers and bringing together Black power. This is when they shot King. This is when they shoot everybody. So please, somebody out there, get this man a bodyguard. But this has become, I think, a great moment. And for Black people who have been watching in some horror, as we've seen Black Lives Matter, the corporation, not Black Lives Matter, the people, not the movement for Black lives that existed for 500 years and will continue to exist. But we've been very disappointed lately as more and more information has come out about how the leadership of BLM has been buying mansions and taking the people's money and not supporting families who have actually been the victims of violence and have been generally enriching themselves and doing everything that this movement was supposed to be against. So a lot of Black people have been feeling this kind of despair at seeing this movement taken from us or co-opted or frittered away. And here we have the ALU showing us that young Black organizers, despite people on Twitter trying to take away the victory, despite people trying to say that Chris shouldn't be taking up space, this is young Black organizers who are showing us that the movement for Black lives is never dead. It will not die. And in fact, it is much more than a t-shirt. It is much more than advocating for the Democratic government. It has been, is, and always will be a broad-based movement of labor, international justice, indigenous sovereignty, anti-racism, fighting for our homes, fighting against police, fighting against the military. So thank you, Amazon, for giving us so much hope this week. And thank you for Chris Smalls and all of the ALU. I think that is the hottest t-shirt on the planet. If anybody watching can get me an ALU shirt, I'll be rocking it on the bridge.
That's it for today, and I love that we're ending on this note of solidarity across all of our movements. Thanks to everyone who tuned into our conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. It also really helps if you can press like on this video. And if you appreciate the work we do, please consider becoming a paying subscriber to The Breach. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca. I'm Dunya Ziai. I'm signing off for all of us on The Breach Show. We'll see you next week.